Our next presenter is Sarah Baum, whose presentation is Substance Use Disorder, a comparison of intervention efficacy. She worked with Dr. Jessica Boyd at Davis, who is presenting in a conference and can't be here today, so I'll have the honor of giving Sarah her cord and stole after her presentation. And just like with our last presentation, we'll have time for Q&A afterwards, but unlike our last presentation, we realized that the clicker does work, but it was turned off. So Sarah is going to be free of my fumbling around, and will take us through her presentation. So without further ado, I want to turn things over to Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So as Dr. Holt said, my presentation is revolving around substance use disorder. So I just wanted to introduce that really quick. So substance use disorder, which later on my slides you're going to see abbreviated as SUD from this point forward, is what we colloquially refer to as drug addiction. And I wanted to study this because it's a pretty prevalent issue in the United States right now. As you can see, I have a statistic which says 20.2 million US adults are diagnosed with substance use disorder. But that was in 2017, and those numbers have only gone up since then. On the right, you can see I have this figure that compares the number of people with substance use disorders in the United States to those that are diabetic. And the amount of people receiving treatment for substance use disorders is almost equivalent to the people not receiving treatment for diabetes. So you have the majority of people with substance use disorder not receiving any treatment at all. Some major symptoms when someone has a substance use disorder are the preoccupation with obtaining and using the substance that they are dependent on. And this can cause them to become really withdrawn from people or activities that were once really important to them. Substance use disorder takes many forms and is across many different types of substances, but the two I decided to focus on for my thesis were opioid use disorder, which I have abbreviated as OUD on my slides, and alcohol use disorder, which you may have heard referred to as alcoholism before, which will be abbreviated as AUD. Substance use disorders are categorized as a mental health condition, and I'm sure a lot of you know mental health conditions like depression, bipolar disorder, and anxiety are already pretty stigmatized, but substance use disorder is unique in the sense that while it is stigmatized and that it's a mental health condition, a lot of the time people place the blame on the person with the disorder, whereas you wouldn't really see that in someone with bipolar disorder, for example. So as I was saying, individuals with substance use disorders do face stigma. They place that stigma on themselves because they're aware of how society perceives them and the stigma society places upon them. If you think about how people with substance use disorders are portrayed in the media, you probably don't think of a lot of positive adjectives or behaviors or traits that are used to describe them. So people struggling with this are pretty aware of that, and this can in fact impede their progress in their recovery, because when they feel that no one thinks that they're able to do better for themselves, it's not exactly motivating for them to go and seek help for themselves as well. So since I'm talking about stigma a lot in my presentation, I just want to provide the definition I was kind of using as I did this study. And after reading the previous literature, I defined it as negative judgments placed on a group, and this is kind of where negative stereotypes come from as well. So the two interventions I was focusing on for my thesis are a biopsychosocial intervention and an emotional appeal intervention. So a biopsychosocial intervention is exactly what it sounds like. It's the biological, psychological, and social factors that would increase someone's propensity to develop a substance use disorder. An example of a biological factor could be what we refer to as the addiction gene. So it's someone's genetic predisposition to develop a substance use disorder. A psychological factor could be something like a mental illness. Say someone's depressed and they tend to self-medicate with alcohol or another substance. And then social factors would include something like someone's peer group or the family they grew up in where substance use is extremely normalized. So this biopsychosocial approach in a lot of literature has been shown to be a major aid in reducing stigma towards substance use disorders, which is why I wanted to include it in my study. And as for the emotional intervention, The whole point of it is to appeal to the person reading its empathy and use language that highlights the struggles of people dealing with a substance use disorder in order to get the participant to empathize or sympathize with that person. This has been studied, but not extensively in this context, let alone compared to a biopsychosocial intervention. So the purpose of the present study, or my study, was to compare the intervention efficacy of both of these appeals, the biopsychosocial and the emotional one, across opioid use disorder and alcohol use disorder. And like I said, there haven't been many studies that have compared this, specifically not in the context of these two substance use disorders, which is why I wanted to look at that. And I hypothesized that opioid use disorder would receive more stigma than alcohol use disorder, and my thinking with that is just the fact that alcohol is a pretty social thing that a lot of people engage in and partake in, and opioids not so much. And then the biopsychosocial intervention was hypothesized to have more efficacy in alleviating stigma towards substance use disorders than the empathetic appeal would. So as for the methods of my study, here I have some participant demographics data with the gender and ethnicity. My advisor, Dr. Davis, and I administered a survey that was done with a software called Qualtrics. She emailed it out to all her students, so predominantly psych and neuroscience majors. And after we had to make some data exclusions, we were left with 52 participants, and we made these data exclusions based on if the participant was able to identify if the fictional person that they read about had the opioid use disorder or the alcohol use disorder. And the average age for our participants was almost 24 years old, but everyone was over the age of 18, and they had to be to partake in the study. So as for my materials, Dr. Davis and I worked to create a vignette which featured a fictional person. I have that on a later slide that you guys will see. And the person in one of them had opioid use disorder, and then the other version, he had alcohol use disorder. Everything about the vignette was the same for both except what he was diagnosed with. And then in order to quantify the stigma, we used something called the stigmatizing attitudes towards people with mental illness measure. And that was 14 items, which I have a sample of later on that I'll go over. And they were presented with a 5-point Likert scale. You guys might not be familiar with that by the name. You've probably seen it. It's when you're presented with a statement, and on one end it says strongly agree, and on one end it says strongly disagree, and then you have some options that are more neutral in the middle. So we asked 7 questions about the participant's own stigma towards the person in the vignette, and then we asked the same 7 items about what we thought the participant thought society or other people might think of that person, that they were the same items. So here you see the sample item, and it says, people with a problem like RJ's are dangerous. So then the participant would either strongly agree, strongly disagree, or fall somewhere in the middle. So then that survey was given both after the vignette and then again after the intervention, whichever one they saw, whether it was the biopsychosocial or the emotional appeal. And the point of doing that was to see which intervention decreased or increased the stigma towards that person. And then all of our survey results were processed in a software called SPSS. So here's the vignette I was talking about. I'll give you guys a second to read it, but basically RJ is a totally fictional person, but the point was to make him sort of relatable, just like he went to college, got a job, experienced ups and downs in life. And this is the version for the opioid use disorder experimental group. So the only difference between this vignette and the vignette that people in the alcohol use disorder group saw was that the word opioid in this was alcohol, but it was pretty much exactly the same. So as for my experimental design, like I kind of touched on already, there are 4 experimental groups. You could have either been put in the opioid use with a biopsychosocial intervention, the opioid use with an appeal to empathy intervention, or alcohol use with a biopsychosocial intervention, or alcohol use with an appeal to empathy. And each participant had an equal chance of being randomly placed into each one of these groups. And so just to kind of explain more about the interventions, the biopsychosocial intervention used language, like I said earlier, that focused on like the biological, psychological, and social influences that may cause someone to fall into a substance use disorder. Whereas the emotional appeal, we kind of talk more about the struggles that someone who has a substance use disorder faces, whether that be in their day-to-day life or as well as like the barriers to treatment. Okay, so now on to my results. So this first set of graphs, the axes are pretty similar. So on the x-axis for both of them is the condition, whether it's alcohol or opioid use. The y-axis is going to be stigma for both of them, but the graph on the left is what we term self-stigma. So it was the stigma that the participant had towards the fictional person in the vignette, whereas the graph on the right is also stigma, but it's the stigma that the participant thought society or other people would have towards the person in the vignette. So this actually kind of contradicted my hypothesis a little bit, because initially I hypothesized that opioid use disorder would be more stigmatized than alcohol use disorder, but as you can see, they're pretty equal. But what was interesting with these results is that it seems like the participants thought that other people would stigmatize the person more than they did. Okay, so then this graph is showing the percent change in the self-stigma. So this one is just how the participant had attitudes towards the person in the vignette for both opioid use disorder and alcohol use disorder. And there were no main effects observed here, but it did go along with my hypothesis in the sense that, as you can see, the opioid use disorder was more resistant to decreasing stigma. So this graph is pretty similar to the last one. It's just different in the sense that this is about how the participant thought other people might be the person in the vignette, so it's the other stigma again. And stigma increased across all groups, except it only decreased, interestingly enough, in the alcohol use disorder group with the biopsychosocial intervention. So as for the discussion, kind of like I just said, the trend for the opioid use disorder was concurrent with my hypothesis in that it was more resistant to change in terms of stigma, but the trend for the biopsychosocial intervention was that it seemed to be not as effective as we thought in decreasing stigma, which actually my mentor, Dr. Davis, did see in a previous study in her lab. In terms of limitations for my study, I think the biggest one was a lack of participants. Like I said, after data exclusions, we only had 52. But I think this kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that a pretty short data collection window. I think it was about 2 weeks, so it's kind of hard to get a lot of participants if your study isn't open that long. Another limitation to the study, I think, is, as you can see, there was a lot of passages that people had to read over and over again and answer a lot of questions. So I think it's possible people may have gotten bored while taking the survey and not took it as seriously after they had to answer a bunch of questions over and over again. And then I think the final limitation in my study was the participants' understanding of substance use disorder. Like I said, my professor, my mentor, Dr. Davis, just emailed it out to all her students. And it's possible some of these people were freshmen, and you don't usually take substance use disorder classes until you're further along in your degree in terms of psych and neuroscience. So it's possible they did not know that much about substance use disorder, and that kind of may have affected how they answered the questions. Then in terms of future research, I think people should continue to compare both the biopsychosocial intervention as well as the empathetic appeal intervention, not only in this context, but as well as other areas of psychology and neuroscience, and also across other substance use disorders. Like I said, I only focused on alcohol and opioids. Thank you.
Questions for Sarah?
Sarah, how long has the empathy thing been on the scene? I mean, it seems like to me it sounds relatively new as an idea. Is that true or not?
I don't think it's that new. I think it's been at least 60 years, but I don't think people use it in this context that often. I'm not sure as to why that is.
So this context is what makes it.
Yeah, It has been shown to decrease stigma in terms of substance use disorders, but it just hasn't been used that often.
Can you tell us a little more about the interventions that the study participants were shown? So they would read like, the story of RJ, or I assume there was a similar one of someone who had alcohol use disorder, and then what were,
So, so you just want me to explain each one?
or then what was the, was it another paragraph of text about the person, or?
So this is the vignette, so everyone saw the exact same one, except there was an alcohol use disorder one, and then the intervention was a separate paragraph. So this was the same for the people who saw the alcohol use disorder, it was just a different substance. So the people that saw the biopsychosocial intervention, after reading this, saw like a paragraph from like, the National Institute of Health explaining like the biological, psychological, social influences that increase someone's propensity to develop a substance use disorder. And then the emotional appeal just kind of talked about how it's really difficult for people to get treatment because it's expensive, or they may not be able to take time off work to go see a doctor.
And not, thank you, that answers my question, thank you. Other questions for Sarah?
Out of curiosity, why do you highlight those two sentences when showing the vignette?
Oh, I just wanted to show like, so the first part is highlighted just so people can say, oh, he's like a quote unquote like a normal, like relatable person, like went to college, had a regular job until he developed a substance use disorder. And then the second sentence I just highlighted just because that's the only part that was changed in terms of the alcohol use disorder. Because it said alcohol use disorder, just use disorder instead of other use disorder.
So would the implication of this kind of research be more for public knowledge, or is it more for altering treatments for the individual moving forward?
Well, my thinking with all of this is like maybe more so like educating people on people with substance use disorders, because a lot of times like, in classes, but like in class, like I remember in high school, like in health class, when people talk about substance use disorder or addiction, they kind of like demonize the person that was an addict. So I feel like if you were to teach someone using something that was shown to alleviate stigma, that would be helpful in terms of that.
I have one last question, but I don't want to. Is there anyone else who wants to ask Sarah a last question? I'm going to take it then. This is so fascinating, Sarah. Thank you. I was wondering, especially when you would describe that you had hypothesized that you would see more self-reported or perceived stigma about opioid use disorder, and that didn't bear out in this particular study set. Do you think some of that could be, and I know this wasn't the point of your study, but if you've taken coursework and just from your broader reading, does some of that you think could that have to do with a larger awareness in America of opioid use in the crisis that we're in, that there's been in the last couple of years more awareness of it than say if you had done this study 5 years ago?
I definitely think so, because I feel like there's like almost every time on the internet there's like a new headline about fentanyl or something like that.
And there's been more in the public awareness, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much. This was fascinating. I know that Dr. Moya Davis really loved working with you and is inspired by all your hard work this semester. She can't be here, and so I get to give you this in recognition of your work on your thesis and also all of your hard work in honors. So
Thank you.
congratulations